Great. Thanks for the warm intro. I appreciate it. Makes me feel old though to like think about how many different kind of experiences I've had at this point. Anyway, it's great to meet everybody. I'm looking forward to this being an interactive session. I thought I would start with just like 10 minutes of content around product strategy because a lot of different people are working on that particular thing right now. It's kind of like, the end of Q4, we bleed into Q1. There's just a lot of product leaders who are getting a lot of pressure to make progress on their product vision, their product strategy. So what are the differences between the two? We're going to cover some of that stuff, and then I'm going to try to give you some very tangible, accessible, relatable pointers as you're kind of like developing your own. And I wanted to take a lot of this content from some of the course so that there's, for those people who are not part of the course currently, can sort of see a lot of the kind of content that's part of it. But I also wanted to make sure that I mixed things up a little bit and gave a little additional information for those who are in the course as well. So it's not just completely redundant with some of the things that they would have picked up there. That's kind of one of the things that we really loved about the Gigantic course is just how interactive it is and how valuable it can be for people to actually have these kinds of like interactions with folks. And that's why I was happy to kind of like join this as well. I'm going to share my screen real quick and I will present a few slides here. Let's see. New slideshow. Okay. Madeline, can everybody see this? Are we good?
Looks good.
All right, excellent. Let's just jump right in. So what I wanted to start with was a little bit of a kind of like clarity about what the difference is between product vision and product strategy and how these things fit together. So if you kind of think about the full stack nature of product management from vision all the way to like road mapping and kind of assuming that execution kind of like goes beyond that, what you really have is this identification of like, who's your target market? What are the jobs to be done that you're going after? What does a big outcome look like for your customers? And hopefully that's kind of like the mission for where you're going, right? From there, you create this vision, which is where you want your product to be in, like, let's say 3 years, 5 years out, something along those lines, that really is kind of like bold and yields this 10x outcome for your customers. From there, that's where we get into product strategy. So vision is kind of like, where are you going? And product strategy is like the path that you generally take to try to get there. From there, you can get into like prioritization frameworks and why you might choose to put something over another. This is the kind of direction that you can give to the members of your team if you're in a product leadership role, or the kinds of direction that you want to provide to the engineering team if you're in more of an IC role within your product group. And then finally, you get into like execution and kind of thinking about what goes into different sprint backlogs and things along those lines. So here's the thing about product strategy. It kind of plays a couple different roles. There's this vision that you establish, and it's ideally really bold. It's long-term. It's something that people find really motivating and exciting. But at the same time, the more motivating and big and exciting it can be, the more daunting at the same time it's also going to feel. Actually, if you don't mind real quick, Yasin and others, if you don't mind just going on mute, that would be great. So it's really helpful that you can clarify how it's achievable to arrive at your vision. And a strategy kind of like proves that it's possible to make it there, right? So sometimes you see something that's really grandiose, et cetera, but you sort of say, hey, look, here's the pathwise steps that we're going to sort of like take to be able to get there. And I think it really makes that vision much more motivating because it kind of takes away the daunting element of it. The second reason that is really valuable is because it kind of sets the stage for what the priorities need to be next and why those need to be the case, and to ensure that you're actually making progress against that vision at the end of the day, and not making the case that just a bunch of immediate, near-term, urgent kind of things are actually beating out those things that really should be the biggest priorities for a product team. So here's the thing about strategy. I often get this kind of question like, well, what's the spreadsheet that I'm supposed to use? Or what's the toolkit that kind of tells me what the right strategy is? And the reality is there is no spreadsheet. You can't just go ask ChatGPT what your perfect strategy is and have it spit out the answer. It'll spit out an answer, but it's not necessarily going to be right. And so I just kind of like note this, which is a lot of people are looking for a scientific approach towards developing their product strategy. And the reality is it's as much of an art as it is a science. And I think it's just kind of important to always keep that in mind. But with that in mind, I think there are some processes, there are some procedures that you can go through that will really help you to think in the sort of like fullest way that you should about your product strategy. And I wanted to kind of like share those with you here. So the first thing that I always recommend for people is you start with the gaps. You have your current product as it stands today. You have the future state of where you want your product to be from a customer experience standpoint. And that's really what your product vision is. Well, there's going to be this obvious massive gap that exists between the two. And I think the first thing you need to do is understand what that scope of work actually is. Like, we're going to have to go from point A to point B. What does that look like? Okay. So the more you can kind of like be clear about that, the better position you're going to be in. The second thing is, while a vision may be sort of like theoretical or sort of like inspirational, etc., the strategy is the part that has to make it very realistic. And so I think it's really critical that you understand what those constraints are that you're going to have to work around along the way. And that could be things like fundraising, it could be competition, it could be different kinds of budget constraints of your customers that you're trying to work through. You name it. There's a variety of things that can potentially get in your way. And as you understand what those things are, you're then going to develop a strategy that's actually realistic to break through those things. The next part is defining what the flywheel of success kind of like looks like. And I think Amazon, for example, is really known as having a good one. If you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to go look up the Amazon flywheel. And really what it is like, as you get more customers on the product, then there's more demand. That's going to get more sellers to kind of come on and sell their products as well. That's going to increase the selection that's there, which is going to lead to a better buyer experience, which is going to encourage more buyers to come to Amazon. Because of the growth that they have, it also generates sort of like lower cost structure for them, which means they can lower their prices and they can improve delivery, like having their own delivery trucks and so on. And that leads to a better customer experience. So you can see how they even have multiple flywheels going on at the same time. And that is sort of like a major part of their overall retail strategy. I'd encourage anybody to think about what that flywheel would look like for their company as well. So define what that flywheel looks like, because that's really going to be sort of the crux of what your product strategy is about, is how you go about crafting that and really getting things kind of like, rolling. So the next question is, what are the sequences of the investments that you really need to make to have that work? So, how can you show progress and outcomes along the way? And I can't stress how important this is, because you can be making really good strides towards this vision, but if you're not delivering incremental outcomes for the business, if you're not showing the progress that's getting made, I guarantee you the rug is going to get pulled out from under you from a CFO who knows what they're doing, right? Because they're going to say, hey, I need to have assurances that this is actually yielding outcomes. It's really costly to the business. And especially in an environment like we're in right now, you have to have some outcomes that you can prove, because otherwise the costs are going to sort of like eat you alive in this moment when capital sort of like matters more now than it really ever has. And then the last thing is, I think it's really important to note with a product strategy that it doesn't have to be this sort of like mastermind, perfect solution that you're locked into, right? At the same time, we're still doing agile development. And so one of the things that's really important with a good strategy is that you have laid out these various milestones along the way. Those milestones are valuable not only for showing what the sequence of the investments are going to be, the outcomes that you're going to deliver along the way, and so on, but they're also these new moments where you can sort of like look ahead and say, does the path that I had originally laid out, like let's say 6 months ago or something like that, still make sense as the path for getting at the vision? And maybe what you'll find is, because you've learned something new, that you should actually modify that strategy, right? And that's okay too, right? A good strategy is something that's also somewhat flexible to allow you to adjust based on the things that you've learned. So look for these kinds of things. And if you can kind of include definitions of each of these 5 things within your product strategy, in general, you're going to have a really strong one that's there as well. So I encourage people to kind of put those things in mind. As you kind of like dig a little bit deeper into the sequencing of delivery, though, I'd say there's a few things to be paying attention to, right? So you want to navigate the financial situation and fundraising, right? If you've got a Series B fundraise that's coming up, then you got to make sure that you're going to be in a good position to actually get a great valuation at that time, so that you can raise enough money so that you can then go do the next things. That's okay. Sometimes you're going to swim a little bit in the wrong direction for where you want to go, because the whole point is to get into a current that's going to take you to where you want to be, right? And the same kind of thing is true when it comes to product strategy. So think about how you can sort of like, as you're navigating around, get to these power-ups that are going to like take you to that next stage, and also avoid the whammies that might get in your way, kind of like, as you're trying to make your progress. So you might want to acquire and extend a competitive advantage that's there, right? If there's something that you can deliver that none of your competitors can, or you can create some sort of an unfair advantage, then that's something that's really worth investing in early, because it's going to sort of propel you to that next stage as well. You might look at serializing the market segments you're going after, or the outcomes that you want to deliver for your customers, and so on. You could look at resolving technical and data dependencies. A good example of this would be like in the world of AI, where you need to have enough training data before you can actually turn on the other parts, right? There's this natural sequence of things that has to happen from a technical standpoint. That's fine. Make sure that you're incorporating that into how you're describing what the sequence of work is that needs to happen. And then finally, of course, as you're making progress, this whole point about the flywheel is hopefully every stage that you kind of like clear with your product strategy, you're also creating new strategic leverage that it makes you in a better position to then hit that next phase of the strategy as well. So these are all just different kinds of considerations. Again, things that you can look at, but again, there's no spreadsheet that's going to like spit out the right answer. These are just things that you should be thinking about as you're doing the hard art type work of delivering a really good product strategy. So I usually encourage people, because there's a lot here, to kind of like break this problem down. And usually it's a matter of thinking from like a backward standpoint. So if your product today is sitting at point A, and you've sort of like clarified with a vision where you want point B to be, and I'm just going to use like an AI example here because we're all talking about AI quite a bit these days. There's this kind of like customer journey vision that you have. Here's the journey that I want to sort of like support. Let's say it's for an AI solution for whatever kind of like market you happen to be in. Well, there's something that's getting in your way. There's a reason that not everybody has already created this out in the market, right? So how are you going to get around that? Well, you might look at things like assets that you can create, like a large data set in this particular case. But in order to get that large data set, how are you going to get there? Well, you probably need a critical mass of users. But then there are some other things that might be hurdles that are in your way. Maybe there's compliance constraints, like in a, in a healthcare perspective, that you have to work through. There might be a scary competitor that's out there that you have to kind of work around. And usually as you're kind of like forging what this strategy is, you can think about working backwards. And so you could say, well, in order to have this AI solution, what would I need? Well, I'd need this large data set. In order to get that, what would I need? Well, I'd need this critical mass of users. And then, that's going to take me back to, well, how am I going to go achieve that? Maybe it's through partnerships. Maybe it's through some sort of, new growth investments that we're going to make, et cetera. So, this is an overly simplified version of it, but it kind of illustrates the point of how thinking backwards can be really helpful. Kind of like solving a maze in reverse is sometimes a little bit easier than trying to kind of like, traverse it the other way. The same kind of thing ends up often being the case with product strategy. Last parts here is I encourage people to break their product strategy down into discrete milestones that have measurable outcomes attached to them, because then you can get buy-in from the rest of the executive team on what the progress is that you're looking to make, how you're going to showcase what that progress looks like, how you're going to deliver outcomes to the business, and then very importantly with this, how that's going to create these moments where you can have a pivot if you need to, based on what you've learned along the way, to then refine what the rest of that strategy is going to be. And really this final slide that I have here just kind of summarizes a lot of the things that I've said about those milestones. So great milestones in your product strategy are things that are essential to it, things that make sense to be built in sequence. So you can say, hey, as I develop this, it makes the next stage in this kind of like product strategy a little bit easier. Things that are measurable, because you don't want to have ambiguity where, you've completed some major milestone and you feel really good about it, but the head of marketing is like, what are you talking about? I think we only just started that, right? There should be no ambiguity about whether you actually hit this thing or not. So make sure that you define it in a measurable way that isn't sort of like subjective across the organization. Ensure that it's achievable. Of course, if you sets the goal to be something that's too big, too broad, then it's never really going to happen. When it does happen, you want to make sure that it actually has business impact. So you can take that to the CEO, the board, the CFO, whoever it is, and say, hey, here's the impact that we're having. This demonstrates the ROI that product development is getting from the work that we're doing on this. And that's why you should continue to invest in this as we kind of like, continue to march forward. There's already enough risk of hitting your vision or executing your strategy as it is, without worrying about the rug getting pulled out from under you because you're not showing the outcomes along the way. It's not good enough to say, hey, just give me 3 years and I'll show you the ROI. At that point, no CFO is ever going to sort of like, be willing to take that, right? And then the last thing is, as we described, you want it to be pivotal so that you can take advantage of new information that you've learned to then tweak what the rest of the product strategy looks like based on the things that you've learned along the way. So anyway, those are sort of like my highlights. This is kind of like my summary in 15 minutes about what makes for a good product strategy. And I'll kind of stop there. And I thought we would just sort of like open it up to questions where I might be able to provide some additional insights for you based on your specific cases.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was just a taste of what Ben goes through in the strategy module of his course. Super, super interesting. Stephen, I see you've got a question. Please go ahead.
I hope I didn't interrupt you.
No, all done. Perfect.
Oh, okay.
Please ask away.
Thank you for the presentation, Ben. I have a question about how you think about financial forecast as part of the strategic product strategy development process. I'll give you a little bit context. I work for a B2C e-commerce business, leading their product management work. And I'm doing the Q1 road mapping right now. So we are trying to forecast how those key initiatives going to impact our KPIs as a way for prioritization. But I think there are two challenges. First, we all know financial forecast never right. And second, some product initiative just hard to put the numbers on.
Yeah, sure.
So what is your take?
Yeah, I think it is important that product leadership does actually set forecasts for the kinds of impact that they're going to have from the at least the set of initiatives that are being invested in, right? And depending on the scale that you're at, that might be easier or harder, right? I don't think it's fair that product leaders kind of feel sometimes that they get like a pass. Look, marketing leaders have a hard time they don't know which investments are going to pay off when they go after certain kinds of new channels or partnership arrangements. Sales doesn't know which deals are most likely to close, and sometimes they're going to have some hits and sometimes they're going to have some misses. And I think the same thing is basically true with product, right? Which is what I would do is I would encourage you to start building a flywheel of success that you're seeing within the work that you've already been doing. So if you look back and you say, the ROI of product development overall has been this because we've spent this amount of money and the combination of outcomes that we've been able to see has been this, then we should be able to continue to get that going forward. Like the best way of forecasting where you're going to be is by looking backwards at like kind of what the marginal impact is that you've had historically. And you can sort of project that going forward as well. Now, what that means is it's not so easy to say, here's the exact impact of this individual feature that we're launching, and then here's the impact of this other individual feature. And at the end of the day, I don't know that a CFO or a board or whatever actually needs to know that. And there's a kind of danger in trying to get too like granular with that impact across each one of these, because what it does is it takes you away from a willingness to experiment. Some things should be misses, right? Like that's actually good if that's happening. Not all the time, but some of the time that's the case. It means that you're being bold, you're being sort of like assertive with what your investments could be. So I encourage you to kind of think about it holistically across product development or across an entire kind of business unit, let's say, and look at the history of what you've been able to deliver and project that kind of thing going forward. And then evaluate it at the end. Have you actually had the impact that you're looking for? And there's a whole, we could talk for 90 minutes about the best ways of actually setting what those specific forecasts are, but it'll probably take me a little bit too much time here, unfortunately.
Sure. Thank you.
Sure. More questions.
Cool.
Well-
So I have a slightly related question because you were mentioning about experimentation. So I wanted to know from your experience, what has been a good way to decide, basically, there's a 70-20-10 method, right? That some companies apply based on the level of maturity, obviously. But from your experience, what has been a good way to decide on how much experimentation to bring into your strategy? And, let's say based on the company maturity level as well, if you can just talk a bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. I always hate to give the answer of it depends without giving additional information, but of course the answer depends. I think it depends on a couple different factors that I would consider. One of them is what type of investments it is that you're looking to make. So I would recommend, for example, that when you're making growth related investments and you're kind of trying to optimize, let's say, a join flow, or you're trying to kind of like optimize a cancellation flow to try to get people to not cancel, et cetera. Those are things where you can have highly measurable impact. There is no sort of like customer discovery work that's really like, driving what you're doing. It's more like whatever works, and we'll kind of like take it to some extent. So those are like really well suited for a huge amount of experimentation. And I would actually recommend that probably what drives it is something on the order of like 80% might be appropriate for experimentation, where you're just running a series of A/B tests to try to like optimize something that's there. And the reason that's the case is, again, because like you're not trying to develop features that are extending the value proposition. Like there isn't a value proposition in a join flow. It's just trying to like kind of maximize the people who are going through. So growth might have more of it, but then other categories of investment, things that are more about driving the value, et cetera, you'd want to take advantage of the things you've learned so far to go build things that are going to have direct measurable impact that you can predict ahead of time are going to be successful. So maybe there it's more like 20% experimentation or 30% experimentation, and the rest being sort of like more what I would consider exploitation of the things that you've learned to date. So you're constantly learning, but you're also constantly exploiting what you're learning. And really, it's kind of a question of the ratios that go between those two. So I think that the category of investments is one factor to consider. And I think the other one is the stage of the product. So if you're in a development process prior to launching an MVP, like you're really at those earliest stages, like what are you going to experiment with? Like you don't have market responses, that you can sort of like utilize. So you have this vision for what you want your MVP to be. And I would just say like all hands on deck, just trying to get that thing out the door. Once you have it out the door, it's almost like you have a backlog or sort of like a debt of like customer feedback, because maybe you're getting feedback from conversations you're having with would-be users and so on, but you don't have real world in the wild market feedback from customers until you actually get it live. So at that point, you probably redirect a lot of your focus to being really heavily based on experimentation. What's working, what's not, how do we get feedback? Is this actually helping to grow the business and so on? And then I think you get later to this point of maturity where you're like kind of beyond product market fit, where now it's not so much about experimentation. You kind of got to product market fit. And at that point, it's like growth, right? So, I don't think that it's an experiment to grow it from a one country solution to an international solution and globalize. Like that's like the opposite of an experiment. Like you're just doing the thing, right? You might be growing in terms of your distribution strategies. You might be growing in terms of the feature set or the value proposition that you're trying to deliver. So I think it sort of varies depending on the stage as well. And those are kind of some stages that I might consider. It's kind of like pre-MVP, MVP to PMF, PMF to growth, and then growth to kind of like essentially like maturity or almost like kind of flatlining for product as well. And I think there's different kind of like ratios that make sense in those cases.
Yeah, agree. I think also something that kind of happens is that a lot of companies tend to not look at experimentation properly, at least in the early stages. I worked with a lot of them through a venture builder. So we would obviously get idea stage, in which case we would try to test out hypothesis. But then when the companies are already in the market, they tend to be very fearful, at least in this region, right? So that specific part where they're supposed to literally play with things, that's where we had to convince them to actually take risks. So that's why, I just wanted to see kind of how you would think about it, just as a general approach.
Yeah, just to follow up on that real quick, I would say that the other thing that's important is that you set the right expectations for what you're going to get from something that's an experiment and something that's not an experiment, right? So if it's something that you're trying to do in order to improve a direct business outcome, set what that business outcome is going to be, measure it accordingly, do some sort of demo back to the engineers in reverse that's like, hey, I asked you to go build this thing and I should promise to you what the outcomes are going to be. Did we actually hit the outcomes, right? I think that's a good sort of like, approach. But when it comes to experiments, it's not about demoing the business outcomes that you got from it. It's about demonstrating what you learned from what you did. And so it's equally valid to learn that this thing doesn't work as that it does. And I think it's just really important to kind of wrap the heads of any other stakeholders and things like that around that at that time to make sure that you're then primed in a position to then demonstrate that it was a successful experiment because you learned that this was not the thing to continue to work on and that it's something else instead, right? So just that mentality is really important. And I think that it's on the product management team to ensure that that's kind of level set and understood up front. And that's why, going back to Stephen's question, I would sort of recommend that you look holistically at the outcomes that you're delivering rather than on an individual basis, because then otherwise every single like thing that doesn't deliver a business outcome is going to be considered a failure. But look, that means that half of your experiments are like failures, but they're not necessarily. The failure of an experiment is when you didn't actually learn anything, right? Because the results were like inconclusive, or it was tainted in some way, et cetera. That's where you make a mistake when it comes to those things. So I think it's just good consideration. I know that we're getting really short on time here, Madeline. I don't know if there were any other questions that you wanted to try to squeeze in.
Not if the audience doesn't have any. Any final questions from our students in the audience?
Right. Well, I will add one quick thing, which is a lot of times the discussions around these topics like strategy, I can try to give like a 15-minute overview of the whole thing, but The reality is the right answer depends on the company, and there's a lot of contextual, things that are out there. Both Carmen and Stephen, I think, indicated that there's some context that's really valuable. If you ever just want to have a conversation with us at Prodify about like half an hour, jump in. We're always just happy to converse with people. And so if you sort of say, hey, I've got this particular situation that's here, or these individual personalities that are involved that are getting in the way, like a lot of times it's that nuance that things kind of like, really take an interesting turn. And we are always happy to share what our knowledge has been that we've kind of picked up over the years on that front. And if that's beneficial to you, I just wanted to kind of throw that out, that's always available. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you'd like to. More than happy to chat with you one-on-one as well.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was super helpful, super useful. I will jump on the back of Ben's comment as well, that our gigantic courses that we run with Ben, we do curate them if you want to bring your team. So if you were interested, I know learning and development budgets open up in the new year. If you wanted to bring your team, whether that's 3 to 15 of you, we can put your team through a curated course, and those mentor sessions could be specific to your needs. So wanted to put that out there as well. A quick wrap up. Massive thank you, Ben, for joining us for this half an hour. Super interesting insights. Thank you for your questions, those of you who asked. We have opened, like I mentioned, the enrollment for the course in January. So feel free to reserve your seat for free. And then when budgets open in the new year, you could go ahead and put the deposit down. So I will send everyone the recording. I do have a question in the chat. Will the slides be available, Ben?
Yeah, happy to share. I'll send them over to you, Madeline, and you can forward them to everybody else.
I will forward you guys the slides. Appreciate that. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Same to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.